Sir Adjutant Vhen had run the night shift on Kestrel Ring for 11 years, and in 11 years, the report had never once come back clean. There was always something. A jammed loader. A worker who collapsed at a bench and had to be logged for productivity loss. A fight between two root cast crews over water rations. The night shift was where the ring's problem surfaced, because the night shift was where nobody with Real rank was watching. Tonight the report was clean. He read it twice. 41 work orders closed. 0 incident flags. 0 disciplinary logs. 0 requests for arbitration. He checked the timestamp to make sure the file hadn't simply failed to load, and it hadn't. Every quota on the lower ring had been met, on time, without a single supervisor issuing an order past the first hour of the shift. Theron's carapace was the dull bronze of STEM caste, mid-tier, the color of a species that had spent 3 centuries administering a hierarchy nobody was supposed to question. He had learned, over those 11 years, to read a work floor the way a physician reads a patient. Silence was never good. Silence meant something was being hidden from him, and the things rootcast workers hid were always, eventually, expensive. He pulled up the floor cameras. The lower ring was where Kestrel Ring kept the people who did not have caste marks at all, the contract labor, the debt-bonded, the species too new or too poor to have bought their way into the Vhen trade lattice. Humans made up most of that crew. Theron watched the footage at triple speed. Nothing unusual. Workers moved between stations. They talked. Occasionally one crew would finish early and drift, without being told, to help a crew that hadn't. That was the thing that stopped him. Nobody had told them to do that. In 11 years, Theron had never seen a work crew help another work crew without a supervisor's order authorizing the labor transfer. It wasn't forbidden. It had simply never occurred to anyone that it needed to be forbidden, because nobody did it. Vhen society ran on a simple and, to Theron, self-evidently correct principle. You did your work, you were paid or fed or housed according to your caste, and you did not spend your effort on someone else's quota. That was not generosity. That was theft from your own future. He watched a human woman, the file tagged her as M. Kade, Route 7, Labor Contract 4471D, finish sealing a cargo pallet 20 minutes ahead of schedule, and instead of logging out, walk 2 aisles over and start loading crates for a different crew entirely. Nobody asked her to. She just did it, said something to the other workers that made one of them laugh, and kept going. Theron sat with that for a long moment. He told himself it meant nothing. Humans were new to the ring. Barely 8 years since the first labor contracts had been signed with Earth's government, a species too poor and too far from anywhere important to negotiate good terms, and new species always had strange habits that wore off once they understood how things worked here. He filed the report as clean, because it was clean, and he did not flag the footage, because there was nothing in the regulations that told him what he would even be flagging it for. But he watched it 3 more times before his shift ended, and each time, the same small cold feeling sat in his gut. The feeling of a physician looking at a patient who is smiling too calmly through pain that should have made them scream. 4 decks down, in a bunk room that smelled permanently of recycled air and machine grease, Mira Kade was not thinking about Sir Adjutant Theron at all. She was thinking about Ilya Bosch's hand. "Let me see it again," she said. Ilya, 61 years old, Route 7 like her, contract debt still running 11 years deep because the interest on a labor bond never seemed to shrink no matter how much you paid into it, held out his right hand. 3 fingers were swollen dark at the middle knuckle. The skin split where a loader clamp had come down half a second before the safety interlock caught it. He'd wrapped it himself in a strip of shirt sleeve. "It's fine," Ilya said, in the voice of a man who had said it's fine about worse things for 40 years and intended to keep doing so until it killed him. "It's not fine. You can't grip with that hand." "I don't need to grip. I need to finish my shift so it doesn't go down as unproductive hours." Mira looked at the swelling and did the math she always did, the math every rootcast worker on the ring did without thinking about it. How many credits was this injury worth against him? How many days would the ring's medical office take to even see him? And whether the answer to both of those questions was going to be worse than the injury itself. "Medical bay," she said. "Now." "Mira. You can't do wiring work with 2 fingers that don't bend, Ilya. You'll drop something, and next time it won't be your hand, it'll be your head." She was already pulling him up by the good arm. "I'll log you out. I'll say it was a supervised transfer. You'll get flagged for unauthorized labor allocation again. Then they can flag me." She said it lightly, the way she'd learned to say most things on the ring, lightly, because the alternative was saying them the way they actually felt, and nobody could afford to walk around feeling the actual weight of this place all day. The medical bay on the lower ring was a single room with 4 cots and a dispensary console that required a caste-tier code to unlock anything past basic analgesic. Mira had watched, in her 3 years on Kestrel Ring, exactly 1 root caste worker get bone knit treatment without a fight, and that worker had been unconscious and bleeding badly enough that even the duty nurse's supervisor couldn't pretend not to notice. The duty nurse today was a young Vhen with pale grey caste markings, STEM, junior tier, who looked at Ilya's hand, looked at his contract tag, and said, "This is listed as a repetitive strain injury. Repetitive strain is not covered under emergency provision." "It's a crush injury," Mira said. "Not repetitive strain. Look at the swelling pattern. The intake form says repetitive strain." "I didn't fill out the intake form." "You did. From the ticket the loader system generated automatically, and the loader system logs every stoppage as repetitive strain because that's the default code and nobody's ever gone back and fixed it." The nurse blinked at her. Vhen faces didn't move the way human faces did, but Mira had spent 3 years learning the small tells anyway, the way the eye ridges lowered slightly when a Vhen was irritated at being questioned by someone 4 castes beneath them. "The default code is the default code," the nurse said, as if that settled something. "Then let me refile the ticket." "You are not medical staff." "I'm not asking to treat him. I'm asking to correct a clerical error in a form he's entitled to have corrected." Mira kept her voice even. She had learned that too, that the moment your voice climbed, you'd already lost, because now you were the emotional one, the irrational one, exactly what they expected from a root caste contract worker complaining about her lot. The nurse looked at her for a long moment, and then did the thing that 9 out of 10 Vhen in a position of small authority did when faced with a problem slightly more complicated than the day called for, pushed it upward. "I'll need a supervisor's authorization to reclassify an intake code." "Which supervisor?" "Whoever is on shift review." "That would be," the nurse checked something, "Sir Adjutant Theron." Mira had never spoken to Sir Adjutant Theron in her life. She knew his name the way every root caste worker knew the names of the mid-tier STEM officers who reviewed the night shift, as a word attached to a shape on a screen, someone whose decisions arrived as denials with no explanation attached. "Fine," she said. "Where do I find him?" She found him in a review office on Deck 12, a narrow room with 3 screens and the particular institutional cleanliness of a space nobody spent any personal time in. Theron looked up when she came in, and Mira watched him place her, Route 7, the loading floor, the footage from an hour ago, though of course she had no way of knowing that yet. "I need an intake reclassification authorized," she said, and put Ilya's ticket on the desk between them. "Crush injury logged as repetitive strain. He can't grip. He needs bone knit, not analgesic." Theron looked at the ticket. Then he looked at her, for slightly longer than the ticket required. "You corrected the nurse's coding yourself," he said. "It wasn't a question. The loader system defaults every stoppage code to repetitive strain. It's a known error. I've seen it 11 times. You've counted." "I keep a list," Mira said, "because nobody else does." Something in Theron's face did the thing Vhen faces did instead of a raised eyebrow, a very slight widening at the eye ridges, gone almost before she registered it. He was quiet for a moment, and Mira braced for the denial, that this is not the correct channel, the small bureaucratic door closing that she'd walked through 100 times before on this station. "Authorized," he said instead, and keyed it through. Mira blinked. "That's it. You're correct that the code is wrong. I have 11 years of stoppage logs that would confirm it if I looked, which I've never done, because nobody has ever asked me to." He handed the ticket back. "Get him to the bay before the correction expires. Reclassifications have a 6-hour authorization window." She took the ticket. At the door, she stopped, because something about the exchange itched at her in a way she didn't have a name for yet. "Why authorize it?" she said. "You didn't have to." Theron considered the question with the same unhurried care he'd given the ticket. "Because you were right," he said, "and I have never once, in 11 years, had a root caste worker walk in here and be right about something I hadn't already noticed myself." He didn't say anything else. Mira left with Ilya's ticket in her hand and the small cold feeling of having been studied, in a way she couldn't quite place, all the way back down to Deck 4. Kestrel Ring turned in a slow, permanent orbit around the gas giant Doras, close enough that the storm bands filled half the sky from the lower observation ports, vast rust and cream rivers of cloud that never stopped moving, which the old-timer said was either the most beautiful or the most exhausting thing to look at, depending on how your shift had gone. The ring had been a Vhen trade station for 140 years before Earth's first contract ships had ever docked there, and everything about it had been built to run on caste. It was not, Mira had come to understand, that the Vhen were cruel exactly, not the way a story would want a villain to be cruel. It was worse than that, in a way. It was that the entire architecture of the place, physical and legal both, simply assumed caste as a fact of nature, the way a building assumes gravity. Crown caste, the elders, silver-marked, maybe 40 individuals total, who governed the ring's trade lattice and answered to nobody nearer than the Vhen homeworld, lived in the upper ring, where the gravity plating was smoothest and the air recyclers were newest. Stem caste, bronze, and grey, ran everything below them: security, logistics, medical, law. And root caste, which on Doras meant 3 different alien species and about 6,000 humans, did the labor that kept the lattice running, on 11 to 30-year debt contracts that had a way of never quite ending. Mira had signed hers at 26, back on Earth, in a recruitment office in a city that had needed the signing bonus more than it had needed her. 11 years, it said. She had done the math more times than she could count and always arrived at the same answer, closer to 14, once interest and productivity shortfalls were added back in. She was 34 now. She tried not to do that math anymore. What she had instead of despair, because despair, she had learned early, was a luxury with no room in this bunkroom, was a system. She kept a physical notebook, paper, because paper couldn't be searched by a station monitor the way a tablet could, and in it she kept lists. The stoppage code error. Which STEM officers would actually read a ticket before denying it and which wouldn't. Which shifts the medical bay was short-staffed and therefore more likely to rubber stamp a request nobody had time to fight. Small, unglamorous knowledge, the kind that didn't win anything by itself but that, added up over 3 years, meant Mira Kade got things done for her crew that other crews simply didn't. "You're going to get yourself flagged as a troublemaker," Ilya told her that evening, hand freshly bone knit and wrapped in a proper medical brace, the good kind, the kind root caste workers almost never saw. A STEM officer who authorizes one favor remembers it. Next time he'll remember you as the woman who makes him do paperwork. Or he remembers me as the reason his stoppage logs stopped being wrong, Mira said, which means less paperwork for him in the long run, not more. That's a very human way of thinking about it. Is it? Vhen don't think in long run, Ilya said. He'd been on the ring 9 years longer than her, long enough to have opinions about the place that had calcified into something like folklore. They think in caste. Whatever your caste's supposed to do, that's what gets done, and thinking past that is somebody else's job. A STEM officer solving a root caste problem more efficiently isn't a virtue to them. It's confusion about whose job it is. Mira thought about Theron's face, the small widening at the eye ridges. I have never once had a root caste worker walk in and be right about something I hadn't already noticed myself. Maybe, she said. Or maybe some of them are bored of being confused. The crack, when it came, was small enough that nobody but Mira noticed it as a crack at all. It happened 3 weeks later, in a supply closet nobody used, where she'd gone looking for a spare coupling seal and instead found a data tablet, old model, crack casing, wedged behind a shelf bracket like someone had shoved it there in a hurry a long time ago and never come back for it. It still held a charge. Mira almost put it back. A lost tablet belonging to some STEM caste clerk was not her problem, and being found with STEM caste property in her possession was the kind of thing that ended contracts early, and not in the good way. But the file directory that came up when she powered it on was labeled in a way that made her stop. Archive, Lattice Accord, Original Ratification, Restricted, Crown Tier Access Only. She didn't have Crown Tier access. She had, evidently, a broken tablet that no longer checked. Mira read for 2 hours in that closet, crouched on an overturned crate, and understood perhaps a third of what she was looking at, because it was written in the dense legal Vhen dialect used only in founding documents, 300 years dead as a spoken register. But she understood enough. The Lattice Accord, the document that established caste as the ring's governing law, the document every contract on Doras ultimately traced its authority back to, had been ratified by a vote of the founding trade families. The vote had not been unanimous. It had been 41 to 39. And of the 39 who voted against binding caste into law permanently, 6 had their voting rights revoked in the same session, on procedural grounds that the archive recorded but did not explain, 3 days before the final tally. 41 to 39 became 41 to 33. once you subtracted the 6. Mira sat with that number for a long time in the closet, the storm bands of doors turning slow and silent through a porthole nobody had bothered to seal properly, and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 3 years reading fine print for a living, that she was holding something the Vhen elders would very much prefer did not exist. She put the tablet in her jacket. She did not tell Ilya that night. She told herself it was because she needed to understand it better first, and that was even partly true. What was also true, though she didn't say it even to herself yet, was that some part of her had already started doing the thing she always did with information, sorting it into a shape that might, someday, be useful. Not a weapon, not yet. More like a spare part, salvaged and set aside, the kind of thing you kept in a drawer for years without knowing what it would fix, only that broken things eventually came along, and it was better to have the part on hand than to go looking for it after. She spent the following nights teaching herself the dead legal dialect properly, instead of skimming it with borrowed translation software that choked on half the syntax. The bunk room had one working reading lamp, shared among 9 cots, and Mira took the 2 a.m. slot because nobody else wanted it, which suited her, because 2 a.m. was also when nobody asked what she was reading. She learned that the lattice accord wasn't one document but 4, stitched together over decades, a trade charter, a labor schedule, a dispute resolution code, and, buried at the back of the archive file like an afterthought, the ratification record itself. She learned that the dispute resolution code, unlike the ratification record, was not restricted at all. It had simply never been read by anyone without a caste mark high enough to be taken seriously when they cited it. She began to understand, turning the pages of a 300-year-old procedural code late at night while her crewmates slept, that the wall around Kestrel Ring's unfairness had never really been a wall. It was a door nobody had ever tried the handle on, because everyone standing on the correct side of it had been taught, since birth, that the handle didn't turn. The thing about the lattice accord, once Mira had spent 3 more weeks with it in stolen hours and borrowed translation software, was that it wasn't secret because reading it was forbidden. Nothing in Vhen law said a root caste worker couldn't read the founding accord. It was secret the way the loader stoppage codes were wrong, not because anyone had built a wall around it, but because nobody with the standing to look had ever had a reason to. That gave Mira an idea she turned over for a long time before she let herself believe it might work. She went back to Theron. It took her a week to find a pretext that wouldn't look like what it was. She settled on the stoppage codes, she'd kept her list, and it had grown, 47 now, each one a root caste worker denied treatment or pay adjustment on a clerical default nobody had ever corrected because correcting it required a STEM tier signature and no STEM officer had ever been asked to give one in bulk. 47, Theron said, looking at the list on her tablet, her own battered one, not the archive tablet, which she'd hidden inside a wall panel in the bunk room and touched only when she was alone. You've documented 47 individual miscodes. There are more. I've only got the ones from my own shift rotation and the 2 crews I run supply drops with. And you want me to authorize all 47 at once. I want you to authorize a standing correction. Change the default code in the loader system so it stops generating the wrong classification in the first place. Then there's no 48th. Theron was quiet for a while. Mira had learned, over the past month of small, careful visits, that his silences meant something specific. Not refusal, not yet, but the sound of a Vhen mind actually working a problem instead of reaching for the caste-shaped answer that usually came preloaded. Do you understand what you're describing? He said finally. In Vhen terms. I'm describing a system fix. You're describing a root caste worker instructing a STEM caste officer to change a Crown-authorized process, on the grounds that it is inefficient. He said it without heat, almost curious. There's no caste framework for that. It isn't that it's forbidden. It's that the sentence doesn't pass. It's like asking whether a number is blue. Does that mean no? It means I don't know what it means yet. He looked at her list again. But 47 miscoded injuries is 47 data points I can put in a report as system inefficiency, which is a category that exists and that I am authorized to correct. I won't file it as a root caste worker was right. I'll file it as a systemic error was identified during shift review. Does it matter which words you use, if the outcome's the same? Theron looked at her for a long moment. The eye ridges did the thing again, wider this time. It matters enormously, he said. Which is, I think, something you already understood when you asked the question. He authorized the standing correction that afternoon. It took the loader system 4 hours to propagate the fix across the lower ring. Mira did not tell anyone what she'd done, because there was no way to explain it that didn't sound like bragging about something too small to brag about, a stoppage code, fixed. But 3 days later, when a young Congolese woman named Priya Anand caught her hand in a seal press and the intake form auto-generated the correct code for the first time in the history of anyone Mira had ever met, and the bone knit treatment was approved in 11 minutes instead of being fought over for 3 days, Mira felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not triumph. Something quieter. The specific, unglamorous satisfaction of a repair holding. Word moved on the lower ring the way water moves through old pipe, slowly, and then all at once, through channels nobody had actually built on purpose. It started with Priya's hand. Then it was the loading crew on Deck 6, who'd had a supervisor docking their pay for a shift shortfall that turned out to be a miscounted inventory batch, corrected within a day once someone thought to ask whose caste actually has standing to fix this instead of simply accepting the dock pay as the cost of being Route 7. Then it was a Van Til family, a spindle-limbed species from 3 systems over, also root caste, also on debt contracts, who had never once in 6 years successfully filed a housing complaint, until one of them cornered Mira in a supply corridor and asked, in halting trade pidgin, how the human crews had gotten a broken air recycler fixed in 4 days when the Van Til crews had been submitting the same request for 2 years. Mira hadn't done anything for the Van Til family specifically. She told them what she'd learned instead, which forms actually got read, which officer would sign something without an argument if you framed it as efficiency rather than fairness, how to word a complaint so it looked like you were doing the STEM officer's job for them rather than asking for a favor. It worked for the Van Til family too. It worked, over the following month, for a resin engineering crew and 2 more human crews and, eventually, for a scattering of low-tier Vhen themselves, because it turned out that caste in the Vhen system had a flaw even among the Vhen, a tier called husk, caste mark but barely, that got treated by STEM and Crown alike with the same casual disregard everyone else on the ring received, and nobody had thought to tell them the trick either. Until someone did. None of this was organizing, exactly. Nobody called a meeting. Mira never stood on a crate and gave a speech, because speeches got noticed and noticed things got shut down. What it was, instead, was information moving between people who had never had a reason to trust each other before, because they had never had anything worth sharing before. Root caste on Kestrel Ring had always been kept separate by design. Different species housed on different decks, different work rotations, different mesh schedules, so that a grievance never had the chance to become a shared grievance. Nobody had built a wall against root caste solidarity because nobody had needed to. The castes had simply never had occasion to speak to each other about anything but logistics. They had occasion now. Theron noticed the pattern before he understood it. Incident reports across 3 separate species crews, previously unconnected by shift or deck, began referencing the same handful of procedural corrections, the same specific phrasing in complaint filings, a formulaic quality that suggested, though he resisted the word for 2 weeks before he let himself use it, coordination. He called Mira into his office again on a pretext of his own this time, a supply discrepancy that didn't actually need her input. "You're teaching people how to write requests that get approved," he said, without preamble. Mira didn't deny it, because there was nothing to deny that was illegal, and she checked. "I'm telling people what I know." "You're telling a Van Til family things a Van Til family has no route to learn on their own, because they don't have your reading rate in Vhen legal dialect and they've never had access to a STEM officer who'd sit still for the questions. Is that against a regulation?" Theron didn't answer immediately, and in the pause, Mira understood that he was doing the same thing he'd done with her 47 stoppage codes, searching the actual text of Vhen law, rather than the unwritten assumption sitting on top of it, for a rule that forbade what she was doing. "No," he said finally, sounding almost surprised by his own answer. "There's no regulation. There's never needed to be one. Because nobody thought root castes would talk to each other. Because nobody thought root castes would find it useful to." He studied her for a long moment. "I want to understand something, and I want an honest answer, not the one you think I want to hear. Why do this? Fixing your own crew's problems, I understand. Self-interest, that translates cleanly across every species I've ever administered. But you've spent weeks helping crews you have no contract overlap with. Species you don't share housing with. What do you gain from a Van Til family's air recycler?" Mira thought about it honestly, because he'd ask her to, and because some instinct told her that a true answer would land better with him than a diplomatic one. "Nothing, directly," she said. "But I've been on this ring 3 years, and in 3 years I've watched every caste, including some of yours, get worn down by a system that only works if nobody compares notes. The moment people compare notes, it turns out most of the unfairness was never a rule. It was just nobody ever being told they could ask. She paused. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. Where I'm from, when something's broken and you know how to fix it, and fixing it doesn't cost you anything, not fixing it feels like a kind of failure. Even if the person it's broken for isn't your responsibility. Even if they're not your caste. We don't really have caste. Not like this. We have plenty of unfairness, she added, before he could mistake her for claiming otherwise, but not a rule that says you're not supposed to notice someone else's. Theron was quiet for a long time after that, longer than any silence he'd given her before, and Mira had the distinct, uncomfortable sense of watching something shift very slowly behind his eyes, like a structure settling under a weight it hadn't been designed to carry. There is going to be a Crown Tier audit in 9 weeks, he said eventually. External. The Homeworld sends inspectors to every major trade ring on a rotating schedule to confirm accord compliance. It has happened 4 times in my career. It has never once found anything, because nothing on this ring has ever changed enough between audits to be worth finding. And now there is a pattern across 3 species and 41 work crews that did not exist 18 months ago, and I do not know what the elders will do when they notice it, because I do not think there is a precedent for this either. He looked at her, and for the first time, Mira thought she saw something that wasn't curiosity. It looked almost like worry. I would be careful, Mira Kade. Efficiency is a category the elders understand and tolerate. I don't know what category this is turning into, and neither, I suspect, do you. The crackdown didn't come from Theron, and it didn't come quietly. It came from Elder Speaker Cassiel Morn, silver-marked, oldest of the 6 elders who sat the ring's governing tier, a Vhen who had held her seat for over a century and who had, until 3 months ago, never had cause to know Mira Kade's name. She knew it now. Mira learned this the way most root caste workers learned anything about the elders, secondhand, through a notice posted to every Dex public terminal, cold and procedural and utterly without room for appeal. Labour Contract 4471D, M. Kade. Suspended pending review. Unauthorised cross-caste coordination. All lower ring inter-crew communication channels restricted to supervised logistics traffic effective immediately. Suspended contract meant no pay. No pay, on an 11-year debt bond, meant the interest kept accruing on a balance she could no longer service, which meant, Mira did the math with the flat, practice speed of someone who had done far worse math before, that her 14 remaining years could become 16, or 20, in the space of 1 notice, without a single hearing. It got worse within the day. Ilya Bosch contract was suspended alongside hers, on the grounds of material assistance to unauthorized coordination, which meant, as far as Mira could tell, that his crime was having been her friend in a bunk room where she'd once talked through a plan out loud. He was reassigned within 48 hours, not suspended like her, reassigned, which sounded almost gentler until she found out where. The deep vents. A maintenance post on the ring's lower thermal exchange, where the heat bled off from Doris's own atmospheric processing ran hot enough that a full shift in the older suits was considered a serious health risk, and Ilya, 61 years old, hand only recently bone-knit, was rated for exactly the kind of light labour the vents did not offer. It's not permanent, Ilya told her, the night before the transfer, in the voice of a man trying to convince himself more than her. It's a reassignment. Reassignments end. Ilya. I've survived worse posts. I'll survive this one. He said it the way he'd said it's fine about his hand, and Mira understood, watching him say it, that some part of him had already accepted that this was simply the shape the world took when you pushed on it, and that accepting it was the only way to keep getting up in the morning. She did not accept it. But for 3 days after he shipped down to the vents, she came as close to giving up as she had in 3 years on the ring. The suspension notice sat on the terminal, unremovable, and every crew she'd spent a year quietly connecting went suddenly, carefully silent, because the notice had done exactly what it was built to do, made the cost of coordination visible and personal and immediate, in a way that abstract solidarity could not outweigh. In the deep vents, Ilya Bosch learned the particular geography of a place built for machines rather than people. The thermal exchange ran along a spine of corridor barely wide enough for 2 workers to pass, hot enough that the older suits, and the vents only ever got the older suits, fogged their faceplates within 20 minutes no matter how the cooling gel was packed. He was rated, on paper, for light labour only. Nobody in the reassignment office had checked the paper. He spent his first shift resealing a valve gasket with his bad hand shaking inside a glove 2 sizes too large, because the good gloves had all gone to workers with fewer years left on their contracts and therefore more reason, in the logic of the place, to be kept alive a little longer. He did not complain. He had never complained, in 9 years longer on the ring than Mira, and he did not start now, because complaining into the silence of a maintenance spine that nobody official ever walked seemed to him like the purest kind of waste. What he did instead, in the 2 hours of rest between shifts, was the same thing he had always done. He watched, and he counted, and he kept a private ledger in his head of which valves ran hottest, which gaskets failed first, which 12-hour stretch of the exchange cycle was the one that would eventually kill somebody if nobody flagged it. He had no tablet to write it in. He had no supply courier of his own. But he assumed, the way he had assumed most things about Mira Kade for 3 years, that if anyone ever asked him what he'd learned down here, he would still have an answer ready. She sat in the bunk room on the third night with the archive tablet in her hands, the founding vote, 41 to 33 once you subtracted the 6 revoked votes, the fraud sitting there in 300-year-old legal dialect, and thought, with a bitterness that surprised her by how quiet it was, what good is knowing, if knowing changes nothing? Vhen found her there. He should not have been able to. Route caste bunkrooms were not on any route a STEM officer had reason to walk. But he came anyway, off duty, no caste markings visible under a plain travel coat, and sat on the crate across from her without asking permission, which for a Vhen officer was itself a kind of statement. "I authorized nothing you did," he said. "Which means I cannot be implicated in it, which means I am still useful to you in a way I would not be if I had simply agreed with you from the start." Mira looked up. "Useful how?" "Elder Speaker Morn suspended your contract on the grounds of unauthorized coordination. But coordination has never been defined in ring law, because it has never needed to be. She is relying on the fact that nobody will challenge the definition, because nobody root caste has ever had the standing, or the nerve, to ask a crown tier elder to define her own terms." He paused. "The external audit is 6 weeks away now, not 9. Moved up. I believe Morn moved the data self, to have this settled and buried before the inspectors arrive. What am I supposed to do with that?" "You are supposed to ask yourself," Vhen said, with the particular careful precision she'd come to recognize as the closest thing he had to urgency, "what an audit is for. It exists to confirm that this ring still operates within the lattice accord as ratified. Not as practiced. As ratified." He looked at her, and at the tablet in her hands, though she was certain he couldn't have known what was on it. If there were ever a document proving this ring has drifted from what the accord actually says, not in some small procedural way, but in its very foundation, the 6 weeks before an audit would be the only 6 weeks in a Vhen century where that document would matter to anyone with the power to act on it. Mira's hands tightened on the tablet. "I need to ask you something," she said slowly, "and I need you to actually answer it, not give me the diplomatic version." "I generally do." "If I show you what's on this tablet, and it's what I think it is, does it help me, or does it just get me killed faster?" Vhen was quiet for a long moment, looking at the battered casing in her hands with an expression Mira had never seen on him before, something that might have been fear, if Vhen fear looked anything like human fear at all. "Show me," he said, "and I will tell you exactly what I believe, and nothing else. I owe you that much. I think, by now, I owe you considerably more." Vhen read the archive file in the bunk room for 40 minutes without speaking, and Mira watched his face do things she'd never seen it do, not the small tell she'd learned to read over months, but something larger, a kind of stillness that looked almost like grief. 41 to 39, he said finally, before the revocations. "Before. I was taught the founding vote was unanimous." His voice had gone very quiet. "Every STEM officer is taught that. It's in the first lesson of caste administration. The accord was ratified by the full and willing consent of the founding trade families, and caste is held for 3 centuries because it was never imposed, only agreed to. That is the entire moral architecture I was given to justify every denial I have ever signed." He looked up at her. 39 families voted against binding it permanently. 6 were stripped of standing 3 days before the tally, for reasons the record does not explain. That is not consent. That is a coup wearing the clothes of a vote. Can you prove the tablet's authentic? The archive seal is homeworld issued and cryptographically dated. It would take the elders considerable effort to argue it was forged, and forging it would itself require crown-tier access nobody rootcast has ever had, which, incidentally, is the strongest argument for its authenticity that exists. You could not have made this, which means someone with standing hid it, a long time ago, and never came back for it. So what do I do with it? Vhen set the tablet down carefully, as if it might go off. You cannot release it yourself. A root caste worker presenting Crown Tier archive material will be arrested for possession before anyone reads a word of it, and the possession charge will be true, regardless of what the document says. The finding needs to reach the auditor's hands through a channel that is standing to be believed. You. Me, Theron said, which is a considerably larger step than authorizing a stoppage code, and I want you to understand that I am aware of that before you ask it of me. He was quiet for a moment. I have spent 11 years believing the hierarchy I administer was justified by something. Not kind. I never believed it was kind, but earned, agreed to, the way a contract is agreed to even when its terms are hard. If that is a lie, then every denial I have signed for 11 years was a denial in service of a lie, and I do not know yet what that makes me. But I know what it makes Elder Speaker Morn, who I believe already knows what this tablet says, because I do not think it is coincidence that the audit was moved up 6 weeks after cross-caste coordination began appearing in my reports. You think she's trying to bury this before the inspectors see it. I think she has been trying to bury it for longer than either of us have been alive, and your coordination network is the first thing in 3 centuries that has ever threatened to shake it loose. The 6 weeks that followed were the strangest of Mira's life on the ring. Theron could not simply hand the tablet to the auditors on arrival. That would implicate him instantly, and worse, would make the finding look like a STEM officer's personal grievance rather than the systemic discovery it was. What he could do, slowly and carefully, was route pieces of it through channels that had never been used for something like this, a formal request for archive verification, filed under his own authority as a routine compliance check ahead of the audit, worded so blandly that nobody above him would think to ask why he'd suddenly developed an interest in 300-year-old ratification records. Mira, meanwhile, did the only thing she had left to do, which was the thing she'd always done. She kept building the network, quietly, crew by crew, species by species, not toward a plan she could have named yet, but toward a simple shared fact that had never existed on Kestrel Ring before. Every root caste worker who heard even a fragment of what was on that tablet, that the caste system they lived and died under had never actually been ratified the way they'd been told, that 6 families had been silenced to make a lie look like consent, carried that fact differently than they'd carried anything before. It wasn't a grievance. Grievances could be managed, denied, buried in procedure. This was something else. It was the specific, quiet fury of people who realized the story they were told about their own unfairness was itself untrue. Ilya, in the deep vents, heard it through a supply courier 11 days after Theron confirmed the seal was genuine. He sent one message back up, through the same courier, 3 words long, that Mira kept in her notebook for the rest of her life. Good. Now what? The auditors arrived on a Crown Tier transport with the unhurried formality of a species that had never once, in 4 previous visits, found anything worth being hurried about. There were 3 of them, silver mark like Morn but visibly senior even to her, homeworld administrators, the kind of Vhen who existed so far above the daily machinery of a single trade ring that Mira had never expected to be in the same deck as one, let alone the same room. Theron's compliance filing had done exactly what he'd hoped. It had flagged the archive verification as routine, low enough priority that it sat in the inspection queue without alarm, scheduled for a mid-audit review on day 4 of a 7-day visit. What he had not been able to control, and what neither of them had planned for, was Elder Speaker Morn's response once she understood, sometime around day 2, that the filing existed at all. She moved first. The notice went out to every deck simultaneously, full lower ring lockdown, all root caste labour confined to bunk decks for the remainder of the audit, official reason listed as quarantine precaution. A lie so thin Mira nearly laughed reading it, except that laughing wasn't an option, because a lockdown meant the auditors would leave in 5 days having seen nothing, and the archive filing, buried in a queue Morn now had every reason to simply delete before day 4 arrived, would vanish. Along with it. It was, Mira understood, watching the lockdown notice scroll across the bunkroom terminal, the all-is-lost moment made procedural, made almost boring, the way real disasters on the ring always were. Not an explosion, not a battle, just a notice, and a queue item quietly deleted, and 11 more years becoming 16 becoming 20 for everyone she'd spent a year connecting. She thought about Ilya in the vents. She thought about Priya's hand, healed clean because a code had been fixed. She thought about the Van Til family's air recycler, and the Husk Tier Vhen who'd never had anyone tell them they could ask for anything at all. And she understood, with a clarity that felt less like courage and more like simple arithmetic, that there was exactly one thing left that a lockdown could not prevent, because a lockdown assumed people would keep working quietly in their bunks until it lifted, and the entire architecture of Kestrel Ring, caste, and quota and contract alike, had never once accounted for the possibility that root caste might simply decide not to. She did not call it a strike, Not in her head, not out loud. She called it the only honest word she had for it: stopping. It took 4 hours to reach every crew, human, Van Til, Sin, Husk, using the same slow water channels that had carried a stoppage code fix a year earlier, and this time nobody hesitated, because everybody already knew what was at stake and what was, at last, within reach. On Deck 6, a loading foreman named Duarte Nunes read the message twice, folded it into his jacket, and told his crew exactly one thing before the 5th hour arrived: that whatever happened next, they were to leave the cargo exactly where it sat, not damaged, not sabotaged, just untouched, because the point was never to hurt the ring, only to stop feeding it. His crew did precisely that. When the hour came, 12 pallets sat sealed and perfect and going nowhere, and Duarte sat down on top of one of them with his arms folded and waited, in a silence that felt, he would say afterward, less like defiance than like exhaling after holding his breath for 9 years. In the Van Til housing block, the family that had once waited 2 years for an air recycler repair did not fully understand what was being asked of them until a younger member, barely out of adolescence by Van Til reckoning, translated the message a third time and then simply stopped moving, mid-task, spindle limbs folded still against a control panel, and one by one the rest of the block did the same, not because they trusted the plan, but because they trusted, for the first time in 6 years, the person who had sent it. The Husk Tier Vhen were the last to stop, and the most frightened to do it, because they alone among the root cast crews had been born into the system they were now refusing, and refusing your own species hierarchy carried a particular weight that no contract worker from off-world could fully share. But they stopped anyway, in ones and twos, and then in whole maintenance crews, standing very still in corridors that had never once, in 3 centuries, held a Husk caste worker who was not working. At the top of the 5th hour of the lockdown, every quota on the lower ring went unmet, not through sabotage, not through violence, but through the simple, total absence of anyone showing up to do the work. The loaders sat empty. The cargo queues backed up. The deep vents, critically, stopped venting, because Ilya Bosch, 61 years old, 2 fingers still faintly stiff, walked away from the thermal exchange console at the appointed hour along with every other worker rated for that post, and nobody remained to keep Doris's bled heat from backing up into the ring's own lower structure. Within 6 hours, temperature alarms were sounding on decks the auditors could not fail to notice, because the auditors were quartered 2 decks above them. Elder Speaker Morn arrived at the lower ring access point personally, which had not happened in Mira's 3 years on the station, flanked by 2 STEM officers and trailed, at a careful distance, by all 3 homeworld auditors, drawn out of their quarters by alarms that a quarantine could not explain. "This is an authorized labor cessation," Morn said, to the assembled crews standing at the threshold, human and Van Til and Sin and Husk alike. More root cast workers gathered in one place than the ring's architecture had ever been designed to allow. Return to your posts and this will be treated as a shift irregularity. Continue, and every contract present will be extended under breach terms. Nobody moved. Mira stepped forward, because someone had to, and because in 3 years she had learned exactly how to say a hard thing in a voice that didn't climb. "There's a compliance filing in the audit queue," she said, not to Morn, but past her, to the 3 silver-marked inspectors standing in the corridor behind her, requesting archive verification of the Lattice Accord's original ratification vote. "It's scheduled for day 4. We'd like it moved to today." One of the senior inspectors, older even than Morn, marked in a silver so pale it was nearly white, looked at Theron, who stood a careful distance from Mira, off-duty, no visible rank, and had clearly been recognized anyway.
"Suradjutant."
"You filed this." "I did," Theron said. "Routine compliance ahead of audit. I would recommend reviewing it before the lockdown proceeds further, given the temperature alarms currently sounding on 3 decks. The inspector held Morn's gaze for a long moment, and Mira watched something pass between 2 Vhen far above her own cast that she couldn't fully read, except that it looked, unmistakably, like an old and very senior species recognizing that a young and troublesome one had found a lever it did not know existed. "Lift the lockdown," the inspector said. "Bring me the filing." For a long moment nobody spoke. The corridor lights on the lower ring ran a duller amber than the upper decks, and in that light Morn's silver cast marks looked almost grey, almost ordinary, almost like she was simply another Vhen standing in a hallway instead of the oldest authority most of the people present had ever stood in front of. "You would risk every contract on this deck," Morn said, to Mira directly now, the first time in 3 months she had addressed her by anything other than a file number. "On the strength of one archive fragment you cannot even prove you found honestly." "I found it in a supply closet," Mira said. "Nobody put it there for me. Nobody needed to. It's been sitting behind a shelf bracket for longer than I've been alive, waiting for someone with a reason to look. She kept her voice level, the way she always did, because the moment it climbed, she'd lose the room, and this was the one room in 3 years she could not afford to lose. You already know what's in it, Elder Speaker. That's why the audit got moved up 6 weeks. That's why this lockdown exists. If you thought the tablet was nothing, you'd have let the inspectors read the filing on day for like the schedule said, and none of us would be standing in this corridor. Morn's eye ridges lowered, slow and heavy, in an expression Mira had learned by now was not confusion but its opposite, the look of someone doing arithmetic they had hoped never to have to do out loud. Return to your posts, Morn said again, but the certainty had gone out of it, and everyone in the corridor, human and Van Til and Resin and Husk alike, seemed to hear the gap where the certainty used to be. Nobody moved. Somewhere behind them, an alarm chime ticked from advisory tone to something sharper. Morn did not lift the lockdown immediately. It took another 40 minutes in which the temperature alarms climbed from advisory to critical, and the inspectors, watching their own quarters' environmental readouts tick upward, made it very clear that a ring administrator who let a habitat overheat during an audit visit rather than restore basic thermal labor was not going to be the one controlling the narrative today. The archive file took 11 minutes to verify once it reached the senior inspector's hands. Mira did not get to watch that part. She was not permitted in the chamber where it happened, and she never fully learned what was said. What she learned instead, over the following days, was the shape of the aftermath, which arrived not as triumph but as something slower and stranger, a formal notice, posted to every deck, that the Lattice Accord's ratification status was under Homeworld review pending findings, that all caste-based contract terms were frozen at current levels, no further interest accrual, no further reassignments, until the review concluded, and that Elder Speaker Cassiel Morn had been recalled to their Homeworld for consultation, a phrase Theron told her, quietly, was Vhen for something considerably more permanent than it sounded. It was not everything. The review would take months, maybe longer. Ilya's contract was frozen, not forgiven, and Mira's own 11 years remained 11 years, not 0. Nobody handed the lower ring a revolution. What they got, instead, was the thing Mira had actually been fighting for since the day she'd walked Ilya's crush injury into a medical bay and been told it was repetitive strain, the system finally, grudgingly, being made to look at itself. Theron found her on the observation deck 3 days later, off duty again, watching the storm bands of Doras turn their slow rust and cream rivers across the dark. "I've been reassigned," he said. "Not punished, reassigned. Compliance liaison, working directly under whichever elder the Homeworld appoints to replace Morn. It is, I am told, an unusual posting for a STEM officer with my record. Because you filed a paper that took down an elder." "Because I filed a paper that took down an elder," Theron agreed, "which is either the most dangerous thing I have ever done or the only useful thing I have done in 11 years, and I confess I am still working out which." He looked at her. "Ilya Bosch is being pulled off the Vhen assignment. Medical review found it exceeded his rating from the start, which was always true and which nobody bothered to check until now." Mira felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized was still clenched. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," Theron said, not unkindly. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I read a document that told me the entire structure I've spent 11 years enforcing was built on 6 silence votes, and I found I could not go on pretending I hadn't read it. You didn't change my mind, Mira Kade. You simply made it impossible for me to keep not looking." They stood together for a while, watching the storms, and Mira thought about the notice she'd read a year ago about a clean night shift with 0 incident reports, and the small cold feeling Theron must have had reading it, the feeling of a physician looking at a patient smiling too calmly through pain that should have made them scream, and understood, now, that the pain hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply, finally, been given somewhere to go. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know," Theron said, and for a Vhen who had spent 11 years administering certainty, it sounded almost like relief. "For the first time in 3 centuries, I don't believe anyone does." Below them, on the lower ring, the loaders had started moving again, not because a supervisor had ordered it, and not because a quota demanded it, but because Priya Annan's crew had finished early and drifted, the way they always did now, 2 aisles over to help a crew that hadn't. Nobody told them to. They just did it, and somewhere in that quiet, ordinary, uncommanded motion was the only ending Mira Kade had ever actually wanted. Not a war won, not an empire broken, just a system, made very slightly more honest than it had been the day before, and still standing.